Thank you for coming out tonight to our Next Generation Hydro speaker event. This is the second speaking event, and I see some familiar faces from our first event and also some familiar faces from other times. I'm Darielle Tallarico. I'm with a company called Tipping Point Strategies, and we've been hired to organize this event and to do what we call the public engagement for this project. We're just one of two consulting firms that are working on this. The other firm is Midgard Consulting, and they're going to be doing most of the speaking tonight. So what I would like to do first is welcome the minister up. He's going to do some introductory remarks. And the minister, we have a new minister for Yukon Development Corporation, and Yukon Development Corporation is responsible for this project. And sometimes I get confused with Yukon Energy. So Yukon Development Corporation owns Yukon Energy. So it's a level above the Energy Corp. And Minister Brad Cathers is the Minister for Justice now, and for the Minister for Yukon Development Corporation and for Yukon Energy. So Minister, would you like to come up and make some opening remarks? Thank you.
Thanks, Darielle, and thank you all for coming out here this evening, and a particular thank you to all who have been here throughout today, beginning with this morning. I know that after we opened it at 9 a.m. this morning, that some of you have been here all or most of the day to participate in the second technical workshop in the series of workshops that are being run by Yukon Development Corporation and with the consultants that have been engaged to help move us forward through this process of identifying opportunities for next generation hydro. This is an important part of having a discussion to ensure that that future generations of Yukoners have their electrical needs met and enjoy the same type of valuable energy legacy that we have all benefited from here in the territory. That work all requires multi-year planning processes. As some of you know, a hydro project is estimated to take 10 to 15 years at least once you factor in identification of the area, permitting the facility, and constructing it. So this is a visioning exercise that your input and your participation is a very important part of helping us and helping the Yukon Development Corporation Board of Directors identify the opportunities for Yukon's next generation hydro, and to help us together come up with a path that best meets the needs of future generations of Yukoners. So today was the second technical workshop. Lands, heritage, economic development, government, First Nations, environmental and energy groups came together to discuss the planning process, and in particular the Part 2 site screening inventory on electrical needs and energy need forecast. You can see some of the work they've done here today displayed on the wall, as well as some of the sites that have made it to the Part 2 site screening inventory. In fact, I believe all of them are identified in the displays that are at the back of the room here today. The Yukon Development Corporation team is working to engage stakeholders in the public to gain your input and participation in this process. And again, it is our hope that together we will be able to identify the best path forward that will meet the needs of future Yukoners, future Yukon generations, and will ensure that they have the same type of positive energy legacy that we have all benefited from in the territory through investments that in some cases were made over 50 years ago in building hydro projects. So I look forward to the discussions tonight and in the coming months, and thank you all for taking time out of your schedules to be here this evening, and a special thank you to those who've been here all day. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge the contribution of Yukon Development Corporation board members who, in addition to the ongoing work that they're doing, have, for some of them have taken the entire day here today to participate and to hear the input from all the stakeholders in this technical workshop.
might not know who you are. So Joanne Fairley is the chair of Yukon Development Corporation. Greg Kamermi is the president of Yukon Development Corporation. And we'll soon hear from Lisa Bradenhorst, who's the project manager for Next Generation Hydro. But just before that, I just thought I'd just let you know what we've been up to. As I mentioned, this is our second workshop, and there's a few people in the room here tonight that were at it today. So what we were trying to achieve today was there's 2 reports that Midgard have just finished. The drafts, yeah, I want a copy. I can never remember their settings. They're very technical. Okay, so you hopefully have picked them up, but it's we've got the results of the screening that has resulted in the projects at the back, which I'll talk about in a minute, which is called Yukon Next Generation Hydro and Transmission Viability Study Site Screening Inventory Part 2. And the other one that we're going to hear about is Yukon's electrical energy and capacity need forecast. And we're looking 20 to 50 years out. So that's what the 2 documents are. That's what the main focus of tonight is. And we're hoping to go from 7, we have to 7 till 9, but we're hoping we'll get to 8:30 where we've finished all the talking and we have time to just, you know, if you want to meet with some of the technical people or even participate in the game that we played today, we can run the game for you as well. So there'll be some time for just mingling. First thing I want to do, because this came up today, is people are starting to hear that, oh, I hear Granite Canyon is being looked at, or Middle Canyon, or False Canyon, there's a lot of canyons, Slate Rapids, or Fraser Falls. So all those names that you see in the back of the room, and the first thing that came up today was, you know, why'd you pick those? And the thing that we want to let you know, and Peter will get into this in more detail, is they weren't actually picked. Those were the sites that remain after Midgard, the consulting firm, did their screening, which took away the sites that made no sense to pursue any further. Now, as part of that was no sites along the Yukon River were to be considered. So anything that could potentially happen on the Yukon River has been removed. And then Midgard, and they'll explain this to you in more detail, have used other criteria to look at what had been over 200 different sites that are potential hydro sites in Yukon. So all those have been removed. And what you see at the back is what is left to look at that's over 10 megawatts in size, okay? So 10 megawatts, people go, what does 10 megawatts mean? The Whitehorse facility in the summertime is a 40 megawatt facility. So that gives you a sense of the size. So what Midgard is looking at is 1/4 of that in size and bigger. So those are the ones that remain. So that does not mean that any one of those is going to be developed. It means that from this point forward, of those that are remaining, there's got to be a lot more work done to look to see if they're even viable. You can mitigate for some of the impacts that could occur. Are they going to produce the right amount of energy for the need in the future? Are they cost effective, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot more work to be done, and that's over the next year, okay? But they will get into more detail about that. So we had a good conversation today, and you're getting basically a snapshot of that conversation. So I'm going to start with Lisa coming up, and she's going to, in case you're new to this process, she's going to introduce you to how it got going, why we're doing it, and where we're at in this year-long process.
So, good evening, everybody. My name is Lisa Badenhorst, and I'm the project director for the Next Generation Hydro project, working under the Yukon Development Corporation. So I want to thank you very much for coming out to our second evening presentation. We really appreciate the turnout that we're getting at these events. Basically, we'll be going through the 2 documents that in draft form are being presented to the workshop yet today and will be presented tomorrow. Daria already pointed those out. One being the short list that we'll be talking about tomorrow, and the electrical needs forecast we discussed today. So we're going to go through some of the slides really quickly because I've started the wrong one. This is the longer version, so we'll do the shorter version today. So this is just going to be about 5 minutes. So I just want to what I'm going to do is go through, review a little bit of the information that we've already got out there about the Next Generation Hydro project, and then I'll be talking about next steps. So this slide here is situating what we're doing right now, the project identification phase, in the Next Generation Hydro project overall. Next Generation Hydro overall is a 10 to 15 year project. And that starts from where we are now, which you can see down, we're in the project identification phase down at the very bottom. And there's multiple steps to go through after this. We'll be going through the project selection and confirmation, then we get into the pre-feasibility study and the feasibility study and the design and the construction, assessing and permitting the construction, and then eventually we get to operation where we're actually turning on and getting electricity from whatever it is the hydro project we build. So I showed in the past slide, we're at that first phase, the project identification. So our goals right now for project identification are to review and assess potential hydro sites according to technical criteria, and those technical criteria were laid out in the directive that was given to YDC by the Yukon government, and I'll talk about those in a minute. In parallel to going through doing that technical review, we're also engaging Yukoners and First Nations to inform them about the project and also to solicit their information or their feedback. So that's what we're doing here. This is a chance to get feedback on the reports that we've developed to date from the general public. Once we've gone through both soliciting the feedback and getting that engagement information and doing the technical review, both of those will be wrapped up in documents and taken to the YDC board. And the YDC board will take that information, and from that we'll make a recommendation on one or more hydro projects to the Yukon government for further development. So the design criteria is made up, or the directive criteria is made up of 7 different criteria. They're all up on the board. If you go to our website, nextgenerationhydro.ca, you'll get more in-depth information about what I'm giving you here. There's actually a web page with pages behind it talking more about the directive criteria. So if you want more information, you can go there. You can also get all the documents that we're presenting there as well. So the directive criteria, the things that we're going to be, or that Midgard's going to be analyzing the 10 sites that exist that are left as potential projects, include things like scalability. Can we build out the project in multiple phases? What are the impacts and benefits from an environmental point of view? What are the impacts and benefits from a socioeconomic point of view? What are the benefits and impacts from a First Nations point of view? Those are the type of things that are found in the directive criteria. It also gives us the mandate to engage with First Nations to talk about hydro projects on their traditional territories. So now it won't work. So I just want to jump to the next steps. So I kind of touched on the technical analysis that'll be happening next that Midgard will be doing. They'll be taking the 10 potential site projects that exist, and they'll be analyzing them against the directive criteria. We'll continue to do bilateral meetings with First Nations and Yukoners. We have a First Nations Energy Forum that'll be happening in May that we'll have as its theme First Nation partnerships in energy projects in general, and specifically in the Next Generation Hydro project. We'll be talking about how First Nations have been involved in energy projects in the past on a partnership basis, and discuss ways that they could be involved in the future. We'll also be having a speaker series that'll be open to the general public. That'll be starting in March probably, and it'll be done on a monthly basis. It'll be a little outside of the Next Generation Hydro project. It'll be looking at things about what are potential strategies to mitigate environmental and socioeconomic impacts. What are some of the renewables that could be used alongside with Next Generation Hydro? And then finally, we'll have our 3rd workshop in September, which will be the viability study. And this is where Midgard's data, where they've analyzed the 10 potential sites that exist still against those design criteria. That data will be gathered up into a matrix, and it'll be made available through the viability study to solicit feedback from the general public. And that's it. Oh, sorry. The one thing I wanted to emphasize, and I think if any of you were here last time at this presentation, I talked about the four-legged stool. And this is really important. At this point, we are just doing the economic needs right now. We're trying to figure out, what's the framework inside which we should be looking for projects, how big a project, how small a project. That's just one part of how we'll assess projects. There's also, what are the cultural and social economic impacts of a project? What are the environmental impacts of a project? How do the economics of the project work out? And also how do the technical side of the project work out? So it's all four of those. We need to find a balanced approach between all four of those legs of the stool. Thank you very much.
Any quick questions for Lisa on the process? Okay. I should just mention that we're videotaping this. So we'll be using the mics because we're trying to keep a record of it so we can put it on the website. So for people who weren't able to come to the event tonight, they can also see the whole thing online. Which, if you missed the first speaking event, you can also go online and see it as well. Okay, so I will just go right to it then. Our next speaker is Michael Walsh, and he's with Midgard Consulting. So I'll let Michael introduce his company and explain the report he did to look at our need in the future. Michael?
Thank you, Daria. Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Walsh, and I'm a principal at Midgard Consulting. And the work that I've done on the project has had to do with assessing the need and forecasting what the need is. So essentially, forecasting how much electricity and the aspects of that energy need is in the future, in the 20 to 50 year time frame. Just to follow up a little bit on Lisa, in terms of the reports that we're doing and so forth, and I'm not going to explain this, but I do want to point out, just on this need side, this is the paper that we're talking about that's in front of you, and the work that I'm doing is this economic growth. And this helps frame, if you will, frame the problem that we then explore solutions, alternative solutions for. So again, my job is to frame up what is it the problem that we're trying to solve. So my mandate, to be a little bit more specific, is I was looking at the electricity need in the Yukon territory for on-grid. There are several off-grid communities, but we didn't look at that. We're simply looking at, in the 20-year to 50-year time frame, so 2035 to 2065, how much electrical energy is required and how much electrical capacity is required or forecast to be required. And I'll get into a moment. The difference between energy and capacity, if you think of a coin, it has the face side and the tail side of a coin. So every project and every electricity facility will always have energy aspects of it and capacity aspects of it. And what energy is essentially when you turn on the light and you keep it on all day, it's the amount of electricity you require over a period of time. But capacity, on the other hand, is how much instantaneously you need. And just to use an analogy, if you have a vehicle, the size of, the number of horsepower in your motor is the capacity. So that's how much you can drive it hard, but how much fuel is in your gas tank is your energy. So they're related, but they are different. And so we looked at both aspects, both from an energy point of view and a capacity point of view, and I'll talk about that in a moment. This is actually, a more realistic actual. So this is where we graphed out an actual day of electricity usage using real data. So the area in blue is your energy, and the measure is typically megawatt hours. And so if you add out all the area below the curve, all the blue area, That's how much energy is being used in the day. Whereas if you look at the red line, that's your capacity need. That is, in the middle of the day, you go up to 48 megawatts. And why this matters is if you do not have the capacity to meet the demand at any point in time, you'll have a blackout. So the forecasting exercise, the whole point of this, I'm not going to pretend I know what the future is. So the idea is to come up with plausible scenarios of what the future may look like. And we put boundaries on this. We put an upper bound and a lower bound about what we think the future will look like. And as Lisa talked about, the idea of being scalability or flexible, I don't know what the future looks like, but I'm going to give you plausible scenarios so that I might be off by a year, or I might be off by 5 years, but that the planning exercise in itself is very, very important, because this doesn't, projects do not happen by themselves. You have to have these discussions, and then you have to do the preparations before they happen. And so consequently, what you're having the discussion about and the whole planning exercise is being driven by the forecast. So you forecast the need, you come up with your plausible, and then you come up with recommendations, and that's what the smart people at this table will do. In terms of forecasting, just to give you an idea of the approach that we took, we looked at the data and we looked at what we knew and what we didn't know. And so when we didn't know something, often used historical experience as a guide for what the future would look like. So let me talk now about energy. So again, this is the number of megawatt hours that are anticipated to be needed in the future. And specifically what we did was come up with a forecast of what the demand for electricity would be, electrical energy, came up with a forecast of the electrical supply, which is a little bit easier because it looks like the assets that exist today. And when you subtract one from the other, it shows the gap. So essentially, what's the size of the problem, if there's any? In terms of the methodology, the key variable that we looked at was population. Looking at historical population, looking at future projected population, and then forecasting it further, and then assuming that there's going to be a consistency of the amount of electricity that people will use in the future. It'll look very similar to what we're using today. There'll just be more people. That gives us a very good proxy for what future electricity demand is going to be. And again, we used a high and a low band to encapsulate a lot of the variables that we really don't know. Are we going to be driving electric cars? Well, maybe. Are we going to heat our homes with more electricity and less wood? There's a distinct possibility. So we created a range in order to capture the possibilities of, well, maybe there'll be a lot more electricity used, or maybe there won't be as much electricity as I'm predicting. Maybe the DSM and the types of efficiency gains that we'll see will be far greater, or maybe there'll just be fewer people that move to the Yukon. But we encapsulated this, and I'll talk about it in a moment. And the main driver of electricity is really the population, the commercial and residential sector. And what we did as well is we forecast the industrial sector. So the industrial sector, for all intent and purposes, is the mining sector. And we looked again historically at the number of mines that are attached to the grid, and looked at the patterns of how much electricity they used, as well as how many of them tend to be in operations at any point in time. So there are certain periods where you had 3 operating, certain periods where you had none operating, but consistently you would have 1 to 2 operating at any point in time. And consistently they used about 50 megawatts of electricity. So I'm getting ahead of myself, so let me just turn the slide. So when I talk about the population, a lot of these details and far greater detail are in the paper. But we just used, again, we looked at historically, which is the green area of this graph. We looked at projections, not our projections, but market projections for the population in the Yukon over the next 20 years, or to 2025 rather. And then from there on, we used a relatively simple approach, straightforward approach to what future population would look like. And this is the basis upon which we then grew out the projections of electrical energy demand in the territory. On the industrial side, as I was referring to, we looked at the historical average of the number of mines that were operating and typically how much electricity they used. And again, we had some discussions about what is a reasonable assumption about how many mines will there be in the future. Will it be greater? Will it be less? But we settled on this being a generic approach that we thought it's defendable and certainly plausible as we look forward and the amount of electricity that would be demanded from the industrial sector. So our base case scenario is that there'll be, on average, 1.5 mines, and on average, they'll be consuming aggregately 75 gigawatt hours, which is 75,000 megawatt hours per year. So what this graph shows is the population plus the industrial, put them together, and that comes up with our projections of what the electrical demand is going to be between the years. Here we have 2031 to 2065. So the Midgard forecast is really focused on the 2035 to 2065, so 20 years out to 50 years out. And what this graph shows is 3 pairs of lines. And the dashed lines are the demand that comes from residential and commercial demand. And the solid line is we added onto that the industrial demand. So the 2 previous slides that we talked about, when you aggregate those numbers together, this is what the demand for electrical energy looks like as per the forecast between the years 35 and 65. We then looked at how much electrical supply there is, and particularly when you're looking 20 years out, what you have is you have your heritage hydro assets that are going to be around, and that the amount of energy that they'll produce going forward will look very much like what they produced in the past. So the dark blue at the bottom is your projected energy production from the three heritage hydro assets. And the area in yellow is representative of the amount of other generation that exists, and specifically the amount of thermal generation that exists, and that for largely acts as backup in emergency situations. And let me point out, the green line that we see, and this graph starts in 2014, so this is starting today, going to 2064. The green line is the actual amount of electricity and the actual forecast based upon YEC's forecasts. And then at the end of that, we get into the Midgard forecast, which is where you'll see the green, blue, and red lines separate from one another. Again, just this yellow section. So let me just point out a couple things. The amount of energy that's consumed in the Yukon today, it's just over 400,000 megawatt hours a year. And when we look forward, as we'll see in a moment, when you look forward to 2035, under the baseline scenario, the projection is that the demand is going to be about 500,000. So about a 25% increase. And again, where that energy comes from changes from year to year. It depends on a lot of variables, but for all intent and purposes, when the water is there and when the hydro is there, it largely comes from hydroelectricity. If there's either a low water year or some other event or an emergency need, that's when you'll tend to see thermal generation. So the yellow is just to demonstrate the theoretical amount of energy that you could get out of thermal. You could actually get more, but again, that's just representative. Many of the thermal generators have all spinning machinery tends to have a life. And most of the thermal generators, although not all of them, will be retired within the next 20 years. Now, they may very well get replaced, their lives may get extended, and I'm not saying whether it should or should, but the graph is representing that this does exist, and whether it exists in the future really is a policy decision. That has nothing to do with this paper. So these gaps, which is basically between the heavy blue and the 3 solid lines, are now represented in this paper. And so what this is saying is how much electrical energy is forecast to be needed in the periods that we have here. So starting in 2035, we have a bar graph for each 5 years going out to 2065. And below, along the bottom, it's under the 3 separate scenarios, so under a high case, a low case, and the baseline case, what that translates into. So again, the example that I used a moment ago was in 2035, under the baseline scenario, the gap, the need for additional electrical energy is approximately 100 gigawatt hours or 103,000 megawatt hours. If there's one graph that you remember from this paper, this is the most important graph, I would say. What we've done, what this graph is showing is taking from the previous slide, we were looking at energy on an annual basis. And what this has done is it takes the annual energy and it shows when your generation from the hydroelectric assets arrives during the year. And so not surprisingly, after the snow melts in the June, July period, you tend to have very heavy hydroelectric. At the same time, your heaviest usage, which are these solid lines at the top. So the dark blue line represents the supply of electrical energy, and the 4 lines at the top, which are 4 individual years forecast in the future, shows on a monthly basis how much electrical energy you're forecast to need for each of these months. And so where you see this white area between the orange curve, which is the 2035 baseline forecast, and the heavy blue area below, where you see the white area, in particular this March period. This is the gap really shows up in these winter months, and in particular this January, February, March, April period, as well the winter. This is really where the gap shows up. And so when you're looking at the problem you're trying to solve, this is the problem that you have to try and solve. And you solve this problem in order to keep the lights on, in order to make sure that there's electricity when you need it. Let me turn now to capacity. And capacity is different than energy. So energy is a little bit easier to grasp, but capacity is very important. And think of capacity as insurance, as your emergency need. So when you're doing a planning exercise for capacity, you need to plan for the situation where how much will I need under an extreme circumstance so that I don't have a blackout? And that's basically the capacity planning exercise. So again, just to remind you, the energy is the blue area, but the capacity is your peak need. And so when we represent capacity, and when you think about capacity, it's often the coldest day, the darkest hour of the year that you'll have this peak need. And I think 2 weeks ago, if I understand correctly, there was a new peak demand, which was about 84 megawatts of demand when there was a cold snap a couple weeks ago. So the methodology that we used in order to look and forecast the capacity gap is very similar to the energy side. We looked at the data that was available. We looked at the need in terms of the demand, the expected demand. We looked at the expected supply, largely based upon what we know exists today and will be existing in the future. And the difference between the two is the gap. What this slide shows you, this is an interesting slide, and what this slide shows you, these are your large three heritage hydro assets. And as you know, as Darielle alluded to earlier, the Whitehorse facility has an installed capacity of 40 megawatts. So typically in the summer, you'll have lots of water, in fact, to the point that you'll often have spilling of water. And it'll be running at 40 megawatts. But in the winter, the reliable amount of megawatts that you can count on from the facility is not 40 megawatts, but rather 24. So it tends not to run at full capacity. So when you think about capacity, it's not just about theoretically you could turn it on to 40 megawatts, but what you can practically do, what can actually happen in the situation where you really do need that power. And that's the really important concept to think about when you think about capacity. It's that emergency situation that you're dealing with. And so here represented are the installed capacity as well as your reliable winter capacity from your three heritage assets. And again, these assets will exist for a long period of time. Most of the other assets will tend to have retired between now and then. And so for planning purposes, hydroelectricity is an extremely important part of the planning exercise. So this graph resembles the energy graph. But there's two very important differences. The first difference is this blue area is small, smaller than the actual winter capacity that I discussed. So let me go back to the previous slide. The reliable winter capacity is 72 megawatts. Whereas when you go to this graph, this number is more like a 40 megawatt. So there's about a 30 and change difference. And the difference is when you're doing emergency planning, you plan for a worst case scenario. You plan for the situation where you will lose or you will not have access to your largest generator. So in this case, it's the ASHAC generator, which is 37 megawatts. So these numbers are actually reduced by approximately 37 megawatts. Now, not coincidentally, the yellow area is your emergency backup. And this is largely your thermal assets. And when push comes to shove and you need the electricity, that's when the thermal assets get turned on, just as they were a couple weeks ago. So your thermal assets work out to be about 40 megawatts. And so your capacity needs, your capacity demand, again, looking at 2014, so more or less today, the capacity demand is about 85 megawatts, which just so happened to be what the all-time demand was last week. And so the forecast methodology that we looked at was, again, to look at the gap. But in this case, unlike the energy, the gap that we looked at was between the dashed yellow line, and the assumption was made that there will be emergency backup. And therefore, I don't know what it'll look like. I don't know what the technology will be used, but I have a high degree of confidence that the utilities will plan for emergency backup. And therefore, the gap in the future that needs to be planned for, to be filled, is the gap between what we believe exists 20 years from now and what the need is going to be. So it's basically the difference between the dashed yellow line and the red line for your low case, the blue line for your baseline case, and the green line for the high case. And that's what these numbers look like this. So essentially, again, let me just point to a couple of these numbers. The low case scenario is an 11 megawatt capacity gap. So just to do a rough comparison to put things in context, 11 megawatts is approximately the reliable winter capacity of the Mayo facility. Under the baseline scenario, so this is the scenario we believe will happen, or we most believe will happen, that gap is 21 megawatts. And so that's a little bit like the Whitehorse facility, which has a winter reliable capacity of 24 megawatts. And then under the high case scenario, the gap is actually 36 megawatts, which again is to use similarity, the ASHAC facility is a 37 megawatt facility. So when you go about 20 years out, when you look at 2055, roughly speaking, that gap has doubled in size. By the time you get to 2065, it's up another 25% or so. Just some rough math. So the conclusion on this slide, just a couple things. The top table is effectively the findings. So under the 3 scenarios for the 4 select years that we selected, 2035 to 2065, it just shows you the 2 sides of the coin. The capacity side and the energy need that has to be addressed. And again, when you look at these numbers, although the 2035 under the baseline scenario, 21 megawatts, about 100 gigawatt hours. Much of that need shows up in the winter months. So the problem, if I had to define it in one word, is there's a winter electricity issue that is ultimately what has to be solved. And I won't read to you, I'm sure you can read yourself, my snappy little takeaways.
Thank Mike very much for your presentation. And we'll call on Peter Helen, who is also with Midgard Consulting, to do his presentation on the second paper.
Thank you, Darielle. As Darielle said, my name is Peter Helland. I'm also a principal at Midgard Consulting. For those of you who were at the evening session in the fall, I will take a couple precious minutes to recap some of the information from that session to provide context for those who missed that session. So off we go. The Yukon is facing a very difficult decision. Some of the key challenges include the Yukon system is a small islanded grid. You are not connected to any of your neighbors electrically, so you must self-supply all the energy and all the capacity you use and require. As Michael indicated, you have a winter peaking system, which means you have a peak demand for energy and capacity in the winter, and this is one of the key issues that you must address. As in all jurisdictions in Canada, I'll argue, there are stakeholder and First Nations concerns, and you must, in today's world, balance environmental, cultural, socioeconomic impacts with technical and economic requirements of a project. So it has to be a balanced project to be acceptable in today's world. So, a brief overview on methodology. Like Michael indicated, he's laying out the need for electricity. What I'll be discussing is some of the options and impacts and the process through which we are going to be going through tonight and into the future about assessing some of those options and impacts. So for those of you, I guess, who were here with in the fall, there was a part 1 of the site screening inventory. I'm going to provide a brief recap of that just to provide context for people who were unable to make that session in the fall. So what we did was we're looking to screen sites to get down to a select short list ultimately of sites that we are going to advance to further study. And like Darielle indicated at the start of this evening, our first step, or part one, was to remove sites from consideration. It didn't say, we were not saying that the remaining sites were good sites or viable sites, but we were removing sites from consideration in the first step, part one. So we'll just quickly describe that to you. It'll be a bit brief, but useful context. So when we started, there were over 200 sites that had been identified and previously studied over the last 60 years. So what we looked to do was reconcile those sites into a smaller list of known project sites and remove redundant sites or sites that have been studied in different variations. So for example, maybe in 1960 it was 30 megawatts, and then it was studied again in 1970 and it was 32 megawatts, and then it was studied again in 1980 and it was 31 megawatts. Well, it's all the same site, so let's eliminate the duplicates. And then we looked at sites that had fundamental development barriers. And what we mean by that is there are certain things that we decided we weren't going to consider. And a few of them were provided to us as sort of, I'll say, edicts or rules. If a site is in a national park, remove it from consideration. If a site was on the main stem of the Yukon River, remove it from consideration. If the site was smaller than 10 megawatts, remove it from consideration. So we were looking at more substantial sites. So there were a few of those fundamental development barriers. Another one was, if you're going to flood a community, an existing community, remove it from consideration. So when we did that, at the end of those first two screens, we were down from 200 plus to 47 sites under consideration. And then we looked at what we called fundamentally uneconomic sites. Examples are a site in the far north of the Yukon would have to, even if it's quite large, it has to run a transmission line all the way down to the southern part of the Yukon. Simply not going to be economic. It just costs too much to build that far north and run a transmission line that distance. And there were other projects that provided very little energy, but they were incredibly large in terms of their civil works and very expensive. So if you were a long way from the transmission grid, or you were a very expensive design with a lot of civil works and a lot of cost for very little benefit in terms of energy and capacity, these projects were removed from consideration. And what we ended up with at the end of those three screens was 16 projects that remained for consideration. And it's those 16 projects that I'd like to discuss with you here this evening. Just to give you a sense, here's a map of the Yukon. The black dots are the locations, the approximate locations of those 16 sites that we'll be discussing here this evening. So, part two. So part one was the screening. Now we're talking about part two, which is an extension of the screening, but an additional level of depth. I like to describe it as peeling the onion. We peeled the first layer off the onion in part one. Now we're going to peel the second layer, and there's probably still another, many, many layers to go over the coming years, but we're just going to peel one more layer off the onion. So the objective of part two is to identify a group of hydroelectric sites that represent the best potential for hydroelectric development in the Yukon. And the key point is so that we can continue with further study to look at balancing or better balancing the value of those sites from an economic or energy and capacity perspective with the impacts of those sites. So basically we're creating a launching point for further studies that look to balance need versus impact. A couple notes that I want to highlight. In hydroelectric development, there's no perfect project. If there was, my job would be very, very easy. Unfortunately, my job is a bit more interesting than that. So there's no perfect project. All projects have benefits or pros and impacts or cons. And it's always a balance, and there's always a difficult decision to make. And not surprisingly, a similar situation exists here in the Yukon. There's no easy answer. There is a very real trade-off between benefits and impacts. And the other thing is the projects, as laid out in the placards at the back of the room, they're informed by historic designs, historic outlooks. So what we're looking to do is inform our opinion about those sites and whether or not they're suitable for further investigation, but it's based primarily on older studies that's been done. From this point forward, we'll be reevaluating these projects and sites on the basis of what I think Lisa this morning described as a 2015 lens, a modern outlook on impacts and benefits. So it's important to just provide that as an overall context, that it's from this launching point forward that we'll be taking a fresh look at these sites and matching their impacts to the need. So we took, from part one, we took the 16 screening sites, and then we evaluated in 4 primary areas: environmental considerations, surface and subsurface considerations, constructability considerations, and economic considerations. So we'll discuss those 4 areas of investigation in a little bit more detail now. And at the end of sort of evaluating on those 4 areas of interest, we end up with a short list of sites. And we basically bring our 16 projects down to a consolidated set of 10 sites that we're going to be investigating in the coming 2015 year. To make things, I'll say, easier, more readable, more understandable, we sort of employed a stoplight system, if you will, for evaluating these parameters. Red, what that implies is this is a significant barrier to development. This is a significant issue that you're going to have to address and dedicate significant time and resources to resolving if you want this project to proceed. Yellow, there's problems here, it's more moderate. Once again, you're still spending resources, time, and attention to resolve these things, but it's not quite as critical or acute as red. And green implies we suspect that the barriers here are low and manageable and don't require quite so much attention at this time. They'll all be addressed as part of future permitting process and analysis process, but it focuses your attention on some of the key challenges early on in the development process. So environmental considerations. It was divided into 3 categories of investigation. The first one was fisheries. What's the impact on fisheries? Primarily salmon, salmon species, bull trout, dolly varden, rainbow trout, whitefish, northern pike, and other species. And also transboundary issues. There's a treaty with Alaska addressing, in particular, salmon migration, habitat on the Yukon River system, and evaluating what constraints those will pose. And the long story short is, for all the hydro projects that remain, fisheries is an area of major concern and future consideration. So it got a high or a red categorization for all the projects across the board. So fish will be a major area of investigation and concern for all the projects. And those challenges must be mitigated to reach a successful or potentially acceptable project. Aquatic species of risk. Various government agencies have lists of aquatic species that are considered, their populations are considered at risk either on a global or a local level. In the Yukon, that's primarily bull trout and dolly varden of the western Arctic population, and the different projects have different categorizations for their impact on those particular species at risk. Just so you know, the results are all summarized at the back, and we'll get to the slides, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time identifying specific projects at this point, but after the presentation, we can go to the back and chat about those things in more detail. We also looked at terrestrial species at risk that had been identified and documented, and there were 68 species across the set of projects that were identified. 3 amphibians, 46 bird species, and 19 mammals. And examples of mammals would be, for example, caribou. And then area 2 of consideration is surface and subsurface considerations. So what we're looking at is land tenure, primarily on the surface, land leases, fee simple lands, other land dispositions, subsurface rights, mining, placer claims, quartz leases, those types of things, coal. And then First Nation settlement lands, looking at Category A, Category B, and fee simple First Nations land in settlement areas, and then also interim protected lands, which were related to lands within the traditional territories of First Nations that have not yet concluded a settlement treaty. So we were looking at these considerations. And what we found, not surprisingly, is that all the projects impact land tenure, interim protected lands, and settlement lands. And this table sort of summarizes it, and it's in the report. But so as a result, they all received a high classification. So this is a major area of concern and focus for all of the projects. The third area of investigation was constructability issues. What we're looking at are terrain issues or land issues that would affect constructability of the projects, which drive a significant fraction of the economics, making it more expensive or less expensive to construct, and also implying construction risk. So making it more challenging for certain projects. And the key characteristics we were looking at was permafrost, terrain hazards, and bedrock faulting. So permafrost, the presence, absence, or distribution of permafrost in the project area, increasing construction costs or causing issues with the dam, changing the ground changing over time, which could cause long-term operational problems for a project. Terrain hazards, for example, avalanches or avalanche chutes. You don't want an avalanche chute right where your powerhouse is. You know, you do want your powerhouse to remain intact for many years rather than getting wiped out by an avalanche. And then bedrock faulting. No point in putting up a dam if the water just leaks around your dam, for example. Area 4, economic considerations. Based on the study that Michael did, what we were looking at was the baseline monthly energy in 2065, looking at how well the project could satisfy that need. Does it have sufficient storage or sufficient water reservoir or fuel storage to be able to deliver energy in the months that you need it most? So are the projects able to store fuel, enough fuel, and then deliver them in the months that you need energy and capacity? And then metric 2 was looking at project size. Sometimes a project could be very large, be oversized, and sure, it can meet your need. But if the project's too large, like it's twice as big as you need it to be to meet that need, in future study, we should probably be looking at potential ways where we could reduce the project size, reduce its impact, reduce its footprint, and find, call it a sweet spot, or an acceptable balance between the need to supply winter energy and capacity and a reduction in footprint and environmental and social impacts. So what we found when we studied the projects was that just about all the projects were able to, in some form, meet the energy gap. They were big enough, they had enough storage to meet the energy gap. There are a few exceptions, some of the smaller projects, Hoole Canyon, Middle or Lower Canyon, the small configuration, they struggled a little bit, but they could also be worked in conjunction with other projects, or there were slightly larger versions of those projects that could be used. And then we looked at what we'll call utilization, but that's basically project size versus need. Is the project appropriately sized for the forecast Yukon need? And what we found was a general trend. The historic studies that had been done generally resulted in projects that are larger than is required to meet Yukon's 20 to 50 year energy and capacity needs. So there's probably an opportunity, and that's what we'll be investigating in the first half of 2015 here, to reduce the project size, still meet the need, but reduce the project size to reduce its impacts, reduce its costs, and basically reduce its footprint on the Earth. So summary, there's no perfect project, but historic designs have tended to oversize projects relative to the need as we see it here in 2015. So what does that imply? That implies that some of the next steps for us as Midgard and the team that we lead is to look at need versus impacts for the project sites that you see at the back. Particular ones of interest, Fraser Falls, fairly high impact overall, similar with Granite Canyon. These tend to be large, oversized projects relative to the Yukon need. Those have to come down in size because their impacts are high. Interesting, that one shifted there, and then there are other projects that have impacts, specific impacts that need to be met. Similarly, Upper Canyon, showing high impacts across the board. That also has to be looked at. In particular, for that project, its impact on Francis Lake. And I hope I got that name right because I sometimes get a couple of the lakes mixed up. Francis Lake, that's a key area of concern for the Upper Canyon projects, and unless the impacts can be reduced on that lake, that project or that site is going to struggle to reach a potential balance between impact and acceptance. So really what I encourage you to do is over the next, I don't know, half hour, review the placards at the back. Will be available to chat and discuss in more detail. I mean, I moved through the areas of consideration fairly quickly, but basically that gives you a summary. Long story short, the soundbite is our next steps are to look at opportunities or options to better balance the need versus the impacts and see if we can find a more acceptable trade-off for some of the projects. And just to give you a sense of what's coming, define the need. That's what Michael was discussing here earlier this evening. That's the top circle or oval, if you will. Site screening, part 1 and 2. This is now complete. Or complete in draft, complete in draft. What you'll be seeing from us over the coming months is a look at transmission and its role in facilitating projects, and then also scalability. How could these projects be sized or grow through time to match the Yukon need? And then along with that will be costing, socioeconomic and additional socioeconomic and environmental impact summaries, and an assessment of the opportunities for trade with your neighbors via transmission. So a series of 5 papers you can expect to see in draft 6 months.